Hello and welcome to JURIST Books. JURIST Books is a forum that bridges the gaps between ideas, libraries, and the authors. In this series of JURIST, we shall be talking with authors of new emerging scholarships. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this interview. Hello, I am Vishwajit Deshmukh, the multimedia co-editor for Jurist Legal News and Commentary. And in this episode of Jurist Books, we shall be interviewing Professor Jason Frank from Cornell University on his new book, The Democratic Sublime.
Good morning. I am Sambhav Sharma, a jurist journalist based in New Delhi, India. I am a final year law student, and today I will be interviewing Dr. Jason Frank. Dr. Frank is the John L. Senior Professor of Government at Cornell University, and his primary field is political theory. Dr. Frank's research and teaching interests include democratic theory, American political thought, modern political theory, and political aesthetics. We welcome you here, Dr. Frank, with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Frank has written his most recent book titled The Democratic Sublime on Aesthetics and Popular Assembly. The book, if I may quickly outline, offers a distinctive and broad interdisciplinary approach to studying the aesthetic dimension of democratic politics, as we call it, and provides a distinctive view on explaining the persistence and power of politics of popular assembly across democracies. Professor, we are glad to have you here, and to proceed with understanding the context and the basic ideology of your book. Your book discusses the transitions in understanding democracy, as I understood it, and how the people stand at the center of this change. The book also highlights the role of people as such in reforms. How did you come up with the idea of basing this book around this context?
Thank you, Sambhav. Well, I think the book really started almost 10 years ago as I was wrapping up my last book, so around 2011, and you might remember that was a year that saw an intensification of what we now might think of as a new international cycle of collective protest, much of it responding to the effects of the financial crisis of 2008. So you can think of, in my own country, in the United States, the Occupy movement, but also the Indignados in Spain, the anti-austerity protests in Greece, the protests in Israel, of course, the Arab Spring, and on and on. And it occurred to me, as these events were unfolding, that the politics of collective protest, that is the politics of crowds, the politics of what a lot of the figures that I've worked on in the past in the 18th and the 19th centuries called the politics of the people out of doors, has played an essential role in modern democratic history, in the unfolding and deepening and the contests around democracy, really since the revolutions of the late 18th century and on into the present day. And the centrality of that politics of collective protest, literal gatherings, physical gatherings, crowds, historians have had a lot to say about their centrality. Scholars of social movements have traced the importance of different repertoires of contention. But democratic theorists, the people that kind of theorize the conditions and expansions of the norms and institutions of democracy, had really had very little to say about the importance of these politics to the history of democracy and to really the meaning of democracy. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about the emergence of the public sphere and the importance of the public sphere to the consolidation of democracy, but not a lot of time thinking about the importance of crowds and what I broadly construe in this book is The Politics of Popular Assembly. So that's really the initial motivation for the book, how I came up with its central framework and the chapters that ultimately made up the book really emerged out of that question for me that was sparked by the initiation of that international cycle of protest in and around 2011.
Right, and to put it correctly, I feel that has not changed so much, in the sense that we around the globe, we see so many protests happening even today. So I think it's completely relevant today to understand the ideology behind all of these protests. To follow up in understanding your approach to this book, Doctor, we see philosophers and artists have traditionally invoked the sublime, as you put it in your book, about an overwhelming experience that transcends the capacities of reason and sort of eludes description. To put it simply, the presentation of the non-presentable. So to understand the context of the book better, how would you interpret the term sublime in a democratic context?
Great. Well, I think to answer that question, it might be helpful to take, first a little bit of a step back and say something about the aesthetics of the sublime. I mean, I think you're right that the idea, this very kind of formal idea of the presentation of the non-presentable is important to how we conceptualize the sublime. But in the period, the book is really focused. I'll say something about the historical context that I'm looking at, and then maybe say something a bit more expansive that is beyond the context. The period that I'm looking at in the book is really what historians typically refer to as the history, the age of revolutions. So thinking about the American independence movement around 1776, and then at the beginning, and then ending around the international revolutions of the middle of the 19th century. 1848 is a helpful date. And in that period, there is the kind of question of aesthetics, the increasing importance of the aesthetics of the sublime in literature, poetry, in visual culture is very marked. And it's often associated with kind of romanticism in general. So as you said, the experience of the sublime is an experience that transcends. There's many different theories of the sublime, obviously, and there's different ways of thinking about the sublime in highly specific, in relationship to highly specific forms of artwork and so on. But broadly, what they share is an experience of awe and magnificence that transcends human instrumentality, human reason, our abilities to represent. It is that which kind of exceeds the realm of human use and reason. So it's an interesting experience to think about in terms of democracy, because democracy is, after all, first and foremost about a kind of affirmation of human autonomy, the ability of human beings to collectively control their political fate, to no longer be subject to forces or norms that transcend the human, right? So in the idea that is already there in the title of the book, The Democratic Sublime, there is a kind of tension that I was very intentionally, putting out there, because the democratic part of that concept seems to affirm human abilities, human agencies, human capacities, our power to take collective control over our own destiny. But the sublime signals a limitation of that ability. So in the book, I know you've read the book, but I do quite a bit with playing out that tension, not to see it as a contradiction, but to really see it as a vivifying or animating force. in democratic histories and democratic politics. So the question, how do you interpret the sublime in a democratic context? For me, it is very, it is centrally concerned with the idea of a democratic people itself. You can think of the power of a monarch, the power of a king, the monarchical or royal forms of authority that in many important ways democratic norms contested and transformed in this very period that I'm looking at. But you can think of the king, and the king's body is present. The king is there wearing the crown. You think of all of the ritual forms of authority that accompany monarchical rule, the scepter, and so on. But the king's body didn't have to be imagined, right? The king was visible in corporeal form. But the people is never visible in that sense. The people, so to get it to the sublime, there is something that is always about the kind of presentation of a non-presentable, a people that always exceeds any given empirical manifestation, say in a crowd, in an example of collective protest, or in the democratic representative officials that claim to rule in the people's name. There's always something that is in excess of any given representation in a democratic context. And that is what really opens this question of the sublime onto questions of democracy and democratic representation in this period. I'm primarily looking in a kind of transatlantic context. I'm looking at a bounded periodization in this kind of age of revolution. But I do hope that some of the problems and dilemmas that I'm exploring in this book have a much broader resonance than that.
In fact, I feel that almost the entire world has seen the transition from authority lying in a royalty or a monarch, as you call it, and transfer it of that authority into the people, and how that transition happened and how people played a crucial role. And until date, people have the authority of electing representatives who will govern them instead of royalty subjecting the people. Having understood the ideology behind the book and the terminology that you've used, I would love to quickly dive into the contents of the book. I personally want to talk to you about the last chapter of the book, which is titled Tocqueville's Religious Terror. So Alexis de Tocqueville, for our viewers, who was a French philosopher, thought that a vibrant religious life was essential for the preservation of democracy. And in fact, he believed that religion was essential to democracy and the only possible long-term counterweight to some of the main threats of democracy. Doctor, my question to you is, how will we view this I know that you've addressed this in the book as well, but for the viewers, how do we view this in today's context, where we see religious fanaticism growing by the day, where we see, and is there a fine line between Tocqueville's ideology of religion and the growing religious fanaticism, which some would say is against the very ideology and identity of democracy? And if there is this fine line, then how do you identify it?
That's a very good question. So, it is very well known. I mean, in my own country, anytime democracy is invoked in its American history, Tocqueville is very frequently invited in as a guide for us to understand what is distinctive about democratic politics in the United States. And he can be an illuminating guide, and he can also, in many ways, I think, lead us down paths that we would not want to follow. But to your question about religion and its relationship to democracy, one of Tocqueville's most familiar and frequently repeated arguments, and I'm just going to kind of restate what you said in a slightly different way and use that as a platform to to maybe offer some reflections that might begin to respond to your question. Tocqueville thought that one of the things that distinguished democracy in the United States, and of course he's primarily comparing it to the emergence of democracy in his own France in the post-revolutionary context, was that democracy in the United States, for all of its conflicts and disagreements, was at bottom supported by a moral consensus that had a religious dimension to it. In other words, you can have disagreements on ideologies, you can have a pretty robust and wide set of disagreements that are based on differences of geography and origin and belief, but that this was really held together by a shared underlying, and for him, Christian consensus that was rooted, in the Puritan townships of 17th century America and so on. We don't have to go into the specifics of his argument. So he did not think that kind of reliance on religious consensus held in France, because the revolution in France was in many ways a revolution that was driven against the authority and authoritarianism, really, of the church and its relationship to the crown. So I think that this is something that Tocqueville is very well known for, but I think it's helpful for us to embed it in a larger concern for him. Right. One of the things that religion did is that he celebrated is that it kept the eye of citizens in politics on higher things. They were not simply concerned with interests and with the needs of this world, but it created a kind of a transcendent significance and grandeur to politics that Tocqueville was very concerned was being lost in the modern age. Now, there are other sources of that grandeur, right, that are not necessarily religious sources. There are aesthetic sources. I mean, Tocqueville, when he's writing about France, and especially about French colonialism, has what I think to our eyes are fairly disturbing things to say about the importance of conquest as a source of grandeur, of this kind of extra, the realm of the magnificence, of the magnificent in politics. So I think, Tocqueville was a liberal of a sort. He was anti-fanatical in a lot of ways and concerned about some of the things that I hear animating your question. But at the same time, he was a very unusual liberal in the sense that, unlike a lot of other 19th century French liberals that he's often compared with, including, and not just French liberals. I mean, you think of somebody like John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was horrified by these aspects of Tocqueville's work. But Tocqueville really thought that endowing the public realm with a kind of transcendence and grandeur was very important to the maintenance of the independence and the autonomy of the public realm. And those are complicated questions, and they are questions that I think open him to, it makes it a bit difficult for us to draw the clear line that you're asking about in your question on the basis of Tocqueville's work itself, because I think I think that there are elements of his work that point in directions, certainly the directions of celebrating colonial conquest, that again, we would not want to follow him down those paths.
Right. In fact, I think even in India and around the world as well, religion is seen as a way of living. It's not so much to do with what fanaticism has now come to be, It's quite different, but I'm sure everybody has different interpretations, and which is why there are differing ideologies. But now, having completely understood the historic aspect of it, quickly coming to the contemporary application and analyzing how the book places in today's world. When we view the rioters who stormed the U.S. Capitol on 6th of January this year, Samuel Fisher is one name that comes to mind. He was one of the rioters who stormed the Capitol building, and he posted a photo of himself with a rifle and a shotgun, with the caption, "Can't wait to bring a liberal back to this Freedom Palace." So, how does your scholarship view such people? And what do these people represent? Because, I mean, some would say, in fact, a lot would say that these people are representing the democratic principles that are believed by many, and it's the free will, it's the will of the people. But at the same time, the other side or the other school of thought would not look at these people in a good light. So, how does your scholarship view people like him?
So I think that we're beginning to get, and we already have a pretty clear picture, but with all the investigations that are underway, we're getting a clearer picture of how the January 6th insurrection was a protest that was orchestrated by a loose network of right-wing militia, white supremacist organizations, but working in coordination with public officials at different levels of government, including the Trump White House, and that orchestration's end goal was the overturning of the results of a legally constituted democratic election. So, as you know, and as the example that you gave indicates, many of the participants in the January 6th insurrection thought that they were rekindling a revolutionary tradition in the United States, right? If you look at some of the symbols that were on display on January 6th, you see the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, the Betsy Ross flag, all kinds of 1776 memorabilia. You have public officials on the far right, like Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, who described the January 6th rebellion as the 1776 moment for the Republicans. So they're clearly trying to situate themselves in relationship to this revolutionary tradition that I have focused on. Is not so much in earlier works, and certainly in my first book, Constituent Moments, which is much more focused on the U.S. case. They're trying to tap into the imaginary, the symbols, and the resources of that tradition in the United States. So in my work from that first book and continuing with the Democratic Sublime that we're kind of talking about today, I have been interested in thinking about how democratic politics, especially that shift from monarchical and royal forms of popular authorization to democratic forms of authorization, brings into view certain dilemmas about the volatility of political representation and the kind of uncertainties and instabilities of political representation opened up by democratic norms, not resolved by them. And the focus has been on, in this most recent book, how forms of collective manifestation and popular assembly carry with them an authority or a distinctively powerful form of political representation when situated in these democratic contexts. Now, that can be organized ideologically in very different ways, as your example of January 6th clearly indicates. I mean, with January 6th, there is a problem of the politics of peoplehood, how you draw the boundary around the people, this is an endemic problem of democratic politics. I think you see a pretty clear evidence of that problem in the January 6th insurrection. But I think you could make the argument that that boundary line is being drawn in the politics that organized that insurrection on white identitarian lines. There's all kinds of different ways. I think, the history of protest and collective protest is in part a history of enacting, contesting, and transforming how we understand democratic peoplehood itself. So I've tried to give a pretty clear view historically, but also theoretically, of how those dilemmas emerge from within a democratic imaginary, but how they are navigated and contested in very different ways across, different democratic histories. So we're faced right now with in the United States, a particularly, in my view, ugly white identitarian form of the politics of peoplehood. And there are many resources that we can call upon, normative resources, historical resources, for condemning that particular manifestation of the kind of dilemmas that I'm looking at. But really, in my work, I've been trying to show, I guess you might call it the problem space, out of which these very powerful and highly contested forms of popular protest and popular assembly have shaped the history of democratic politics in these very different geographies and time periods.
I agree. I most definitely agree with what you said about the authority lying in the people, and also that authority being subjective and endemic and depending on the situation as well. Living in the world's largest constitutional democracy, I am reminded of so many protests that I've seen, which have sort of led to certain changes. Even presently, we have farmer protests going on in India, protesting farm laws which were passed by the Parliament of India. So I think you're absolutely right when you say that these people, given the fact that they're not only a part of the democracy, but in fact elect the leaders who then govern the subjects or the people, as we call it, they have a huge or a very vital importance in the democracy. They can make governments, they can break governments. So, which is why I think your book definitely portrays how the vitality of the people in the democracy is. Now, given the fact that there are multiple political scenarios happening around the world, we at JURIST specifically have actively been involved in reporting the incidents, from the Myanmar military coups to the recent Afghanistan takeover by the Taliban. And we see large protests emerging in Myanmar with slogans, symbols in the history, protest songs by the people. So internationally, JURIST has been, if I may say so, digital protesting these actions and has been doing campaigns since 1999, I think, starting with the Kosovo War. So my question to you is, with the new technological advancements in the world, given the fact that technology in the 21st century has become an indispensable part of our lives. We live in a world where any information is just a click of a button away. So why not use that for democracy as well? So my question is, with these new digital protests and campaigns like JURIST coming up, how is the democratic value of protests changing, and how is the understanding of these protests? Because I think if I say the word protest today, it will mean taking to the streets, raising slogans and doing something tangible. But where do these digital protests, as they're coming up, fit in the larger context of democratic change?
I think that is such a rich and interesting question. I mean, it really does bring us back to the first question you asked me about how the ideas for this book initially took shape. Because there is you're pointing to a very crucial context for understanding our contemporary political conjuncture, which is to say, we live in a time of unprecedented technological mediation through digital and other means. So it is interesting that in this time, when we have the tools to organize and allocate movements, aggregate opinions through digital means and on platforms that are digitally mediated in this way, that even still the politics of physical gathering in the streets and squares of cities and towns around the world plays such an essential role in our democratic politics and democratizing politics, right? So I don't think these two things are in clear opposition to one another. And it's not as if gatherings of people in public squares, the politics of collective protest in these non-digital platforms are themselves unmediated, right? They too are mediated in ways that I try to describe in the book. But it's not the kind of digital mediation that I think you're pointing to in your question. I mean, for me, I think it's very important that JURIST is creating, not just engaged in these forms of activism, but creating in some ways a kind of a database for understanding them in their international context. One very important question, it seems to me, for our moment that connects these two different elements is to understand more clearly how the digital forms of protest and organization and political coordination that you're talking about interact with dynamically the collective protest on the ground, the persistence of physical gatherings of people out of doors. Because we know from the contemporary examples that you're pointing to in your question, that the influence of social media on the protests happening in the street and the kind of dynamic feedback loop of what's going on in the street with what's going on in social media. I mean, I don't know as much about the situation in Myanmar, for example, as you probably do, but I followed pretty closely what was going on in Hong Kong a couple of years ago. And that provided an incredibly rich, powerful example of the kind of dynamic that I'm trying to point to in the relationship between these digital forms of political coordination and protest politics and the actual gathering of people on the grounds, the irreplaceable importance in terms of democratic representation of people physically assembling in public spaces.
Exactly. In fact, I feel that the fact that you've heard about or have read about the Hong Kong protests and everybody, and I sitting in India now know about the Myanmar protests, the credit of course goes to technology. But I think you're right that technological or digital protests, as we call them, don't replace, but I think complement the on-ground protests, especially when we consider the fact that there are internet services suspended in Myanmar, in multiple places, in multiple countries, in fact, that call themselves democracies. So I think there it's extremely crucial to have on-ground protests and wherever possible disseminate the information through the internet. So you're right. I think the dynamic is as such that they're not in contrast, but they complement each other in a way where sort of both go hand in hand. Right. I think with this, we will conclude the interview, Professor. It was a pleasure, and I personally, having read your book, found it really insightful. And I would like to thank you for taking out the time for this interview.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much.